So yeah, as mentioned, my name is Tom Denoway. I'm with Baker Tilly. You may formerly have known of us as Springstead. We joined with the firm Baker Tilly just a touch more than a year ago on April 1 of 2019. We became part of the Baker Tilly group, and we joined at the same time as another company called UMBA, which is a similar public financial advisory firm out of Indianapolis. So we both joined and added to the company at that point in time. So are you guys, which version of my PowerPoint are you seeing? Are you seeing the smaller version or the full screen?
It's the
presenter
smaller.
notes.
Smaller.
Okay, let me, for whatever reason it's displaying. Let me switch screens to share.
I think you might be able to hit display settings at the top and it might toggle it right above the window near the top that says display settings.
Yeah, there we go. There we go. Yes, all right, so to begin with, what is TIF? TIF is a method of capturing tax-based growth resulting from new development. So the tax increment district will capture the new local taxes, or the incremental growth in those taxes to pay for public improvements related to the development. And there's a fixed term for the capture, and then the development is added to the tax base. So you can see here the state statutes that define tax increment financing. I'm not going to go through all those in all that great detail. I don't want to put anybody back to bed this early in the morning. But mainly the idea with TIF is that it is a gap financing tool. It is a program or a tool for making projects happen that would not otherwise happen. TIF is continually being refined by the legislature each year, so depending on the year that it's created, there are different compliance requirements. And it's used mainly by cities and counties, and the idea behind it is to provide an incentive for development and to help fill that gap and make projects occur that would not otherwise occur. So there's a number of TIF districts, different types of TIF districts that could be put in place. Depending on the type of district, there are certain criteria that have to be in place for why or how that district could be created. And then there's differing terms for the length of the district based on the type. For the top two, for redevelopment, renewal and renovation, and soils conditions, each of those districts can be created on the basis of the current condition of the property. So these are kind of a current environmental factor that would cause the district to be able to be created under one of these three types of uses. So for redevelopment and renewal and renovation districts, those are situations where you have to have a blighted property with substandard buildings on it. And I'll talk about what the definition of that is for redevelopment at the end of the presentation. And depending on the type of district there, you can have 25 years or 15 years. It's important to remember when I talk about these terms for the length of the duration of the district is that these are the way that they're referred to in statute, but the language is actually 25 years from the first receipt of TIF or 15 years from the first receipt of TIF. So it's the actual duration is these numbers plus one. So districts are either capable of being created on the basis of the current condition of the property, i.e. blighted in most cases, or in a soils condition having contaminated soils, or they're able to be created on the basis of the post-development use of the property. So for housing districts, if you are creating lower moderate income housing and setting aside a portion of the units for people meeting certain income thresholds, that's how you would create a housing district. So that doesn't, that could be a greenfield site with zero issues, but it's the end use of the property that qualifies it for creation within a housing district. Similarly, with economic development, could be a greenfield site, but it's the end use of the property and the manufacturing use in that case that allows that property to be created within a TIF district, and that has the shortest period at 8 years from the first receipt. Economic development districts are about creating jobs within a limited scope of project types, mostly manufacturing related, and also warehousing and distribution. Unfortunately, like office or retail type uses are not eligible under an economic development district. So what can we use TIF revenue for? We can use it for eligible costs related to the following categories: public improvements, land acquisition, soil correction, site prep, demolition, relocation, and then as well as interest costs associated with the above, or reimbursing the developer for the above. And then the city's able to retain up to 10% of the revenue for the administrative purposes or administrative costs associated with maintaining and managing the district over its lifetime. So mostly when we talk about these eligible improvements, they're kind of what we refer to as kind of quote unquote grounded down type improvements. And these are defined and limited by statute. There is a little more flexibility with a housing district. You can actually create and build vertical improvements as well, or reimburse a developer for vertical improvements. But in most cases, it's these categories within which we can reimburse a developer for eligible improvements. So when we talk about public improvements, we're talking about hard costs such as like streets and roads, utilities, bridges, interchanges, parking, sidewalks and walkways, and then any engineering costs associated with the design of those. The things that we can't do are public buildings such as city centers, public safety, public works buildings, culture and recreation, and then administration beyond 10% of collection. You used to be able to do some things in those categories, but it's been continually legislated out of existence and out of eligibility for TIF purposes. So how is a TIF district created? So first, the city, or in this case, the Port Authority, would have a development district, which is a larger area within which that they create individual TIF districts. I would need to go back and check for Fergus. Most cities have a development district that is already the boundaries of the city. It just keeps things simple, and then within that, you can create individual TIF districts. As part of creating a TIF district, there's a statutory process that has to be gone through that includes drafting a TIF plan. That the TIF plan is kind of the who, what, where, and why of the TIF district. And we have to share that plan 30 days prior to the public hearing with the county and the school district so that they can provide any comment they want on it in advance of the public hearing. And then there has to be a public hearing that's been duly noticed, and a bit of a statutory process related to that. And then following that, you could certify a district, and then it would go on the tax rolls. So it's approximately a 60-day process, 60 to 90 days, depending on how meeting dates line up. It includes specific notifications and publications, and it's all kind of as defined by statute. So how is tax increment revenue created? And I think that to begin with, you have to understand how property taxes are calculated within Minnesota. I'm not going to go too deep into this, just in case everybody gets scared. There's a lot of numbers there this early in the morning, because I kind of am. The big thing to remember with Minnesota and property taxes is it's kind of a two-step process. So we take a market value and we convert it to what's known as a tax capacity based on the use of the property. And then we apply to that tax capacity the local tax rates, and that's where we end up with our local property tax amount. The big thing here is this conversion from market value to tax capacity based on use is defined by the class rate that's used is defined by the use of the property. And the reason Minnesota does this is because it shifts a higher burden of the property taxes to commercial property and away from residential property. So right here is a rental example. So the rental class rate is 1.25%. So 250,000 in market value multiplied by 1.25% becomes 3,000 in tax capacity. If this was a commercial property, this number would be 2%. So in commercial property, 250,000 would be 4,000 or 5,000 in tax capacity, and then which would then have a higher tax rate, or the same tax rate applied to it, and create a higher amount of taxes. Conversely, single family residential or all residential is 1%. So if you think about the difference between 2% here and 1% here, it means two buildings of the same market value, if it's a commercial property, will have twice as high of a local amount of property taxes as a residential property. That's the way the state process shifts the tax burden more so to commercial property than to residential property. I mainly point this out because most of the TIF stuff and most of the TIF calculations define or deal within net tax capacity numbers on the tax capacity side. So I wanted you to understand how we went from market value to tax capacity. So how is TIF calculated? This is kind of the technical version. It's net tax capacity from existing land value and building value. It's called and are in the existing land and building value is called the original net tax capacity after conversion from the base value. It's easier just to show it. So the important thing to remember with TIF is that the original value and the value that's in place on the property now continues to remain in place and continues to go to the taxing entities in the level that it's currently being calculated at. So there's no loss of existing market value or tax base to the taxing jurisdictions as a result of a tax increment district being created. What is lost is the increase that would result from that project in market value and in tax revenue. That incremental increase, these kind of green numbers here, is the amount that gets lost and captured as tax increment revenue and diverted back to the city or the port authority. So again, on the left here, you can see market value. You know, if we had a property that was originally 50,000 in market value, we added 200,000 in value to it, we would have a total of 250. Our tax capacity would go up, our total taxes would go up. That incremental growth in taxes is what would be captured as tax increment revenue and set aside. The existing level of taxes that are currently on the property would still be captured and still go to the taxing entities as it's currently being generated. So there's no loss of existing revenue. It's a loss of benefit from the new project, essentially, is how TIF works. It's the capturing of that future incremental revenue growth. So again, a little more visually, the base value stays in place. Our new building comes online as the new taxes generated off of that new value are captured for the term of the TIF district and set aside as tax increment revenue. Again, here you've kind of got the aqua color as the base taxes, and this kind of shows it again over time. You know, you have the district creation, you have the length of the district, then you have the end. So base taxes continue to go to the taxing entities as they were being generated. The new taxes go up and over time get captured. That incremental growth gets captured as TIF. And then at the end, all of this falls off and goes back onto the general tax base, and then all taxing entities benefit to the full extent of the market value of the property as normal taxes, no longer getting set aside as TIF. So this is kind of what a sample TIF run would look like within a TIF plan. So on the left here, you can see the market value, you can see the years, you can see the market value, it gets converted to tax capacity. We take out the amount that's applicable to the base value because that still goes to the taxing entities. And then we have our net growth multiplied by our local tax rate. This is the combination of the city, the county, the school district, and then some of the smaller watershed type entities. You end up with your annual gross tax increment. The state auditor takes their little cut, and then you've got the net, and then the cities usually they can retain up to 10% of their revenue, or up to 10% for administrative retainage. And then you'd have the net amount that would flow to the developer as a result of this project, or would be able to be used by the city depending on the way the financing mechanism of the district was set up. And that's kind of the next step, and the next question is, how do we finance project costs that are being incurred within a TIF district? So tax increments of future revenue, it's revenue dollars that aren't in existence today, are going to be generated incrementally over a period of 1 to 26 years, but they're going to be used to reimburse or pay for costs that are being incurred today. So if there's a new project being developed, either the developer or the city is going to be providing assistance to that project, and they're going to be incurring actual tax dollars in today's dollars. And it's the reimbursement of that over time is where the TIF revenue comes in. But how do we fund that gap in the interim period? So there's really two ways we can go about doing this. And the main difference in these two methodologies is, where does the risk fall? So under a pay-as-you-go agreement, this puts all the risk on the developer's shoulders. The developer will be responsible for funding all the public improvements that would be reimbursed by TIF. And then they would be reimbursed by the tax increment revenue to the extent it's generated by the city on an annual basis over the life of the district. So the developer is coming out of pocket. They're paying for those things that we say, all right, we'll reimburse you for. And then they run the risk that the tax increment revenue is going to come in as projected. There is some flexibility and variability to that future tax revenue because it's based on current tax rates, market value conditions, and the tax structure. In 2002, under the Ventura administration, they actually changed the tax structure significantly, and it significantly reduced tax increment revenue because those class rates that I was talking about before used to be significantly higher. They're now lower, and they were adjusted down to, like, say, the 2% for commercial and the 1% for residential. They had been higher. Well, that significantly decreased tax revenue, and that was due to the shifting of the funding of the school districts more to a state-based system as opposed to a local property tax-based system. So there's some variability to that future revenue. In the cases of pay-as-you-go districts, that was the developer's risk. The city had no other obligation in those cases to make any additional payments in the event that tax increment revenue came in less than projected. Their only obligation was to provide whatever the sharing ratio was that was included within the development agreement, and to the extent that the revenue was less, it was less. So the other end of that paradigm is that the city does possess the ability to issue general obligation tax increment bonds. So this is if the city wanted to step in and fund the cost up front themselves, they could issue general obligation bonds, of which they can issue tax increment bonds as long as they have enough revenue to pay, or enough TIF revenue to pay at least 20% of the debt service cost. And they could levy for the rest if they so wanted. In most cases, they try to line up the amount of borrowing with the amount of tax increment revenue. But the idea with the tax increment bonds is that the risk is then on the city, and that the city would have to make up any shortfalls in TIF revenue in the event that there was less revenue than necessary to meet the debt service. In most cases, most projects are done on a pay-as-you-go basis, but depending on the type of project, the transformative nature of it, or the significance of it, sometimes tax increment bonds are a worthy and reasonable choice. It depends on the project, but most times we go with the pay-as-you-go district because it puts that future performance risk on the developer, and the city doesn't have any downside risk in that case. So what is the impact of TIF on taxes? So TIF does redirect those future tax dollars to meet the defined public purpose of the district. It allows a project to occur that would not otherwise occur, which is kind of what's known as the but-for test. I'll talk about that in a little bit. And it does add tax base upon the decertification of the district. So there is a long-term investment component there. The things it doesn't do is it doesn't provide additional tax base to offset the cost of potentially serving that project. Anytime you're adding a new development within a city, there's going to be some incremental growth in the city's cost of service, or any of the taxing jurisdictions' cost of service. It's going to be a small amount because it would be a very proportional increase when viewed against the size of the city as a whole. One project is not going to create a significant new increase in cost, but there is an additional thing that would need to be serviced by city services, and there would not be a corresponding increase in market value. So that impact does just generally get spread against the tax base as a whole, where one side might tick up a little bit, but there's not a corresponding increase in market value. So that is a downside of TIF. There is another benefit to TIF, is TIF does capture the combined taxes of the city, the county, and the school district. One of the things that is slightly unique about TIF is property taxes. There's most of it's tax capacity based, which I explained before, but there are certain components of taxes known as what are referendum market value based taxes. So they're based on the market value of the property and not the tax capacity. And referendum market value taxes are very applicable to school districts, as a portion of their property tax revenue is captured on that basis. So for school districts, the important thing with referendum market value taxes is that they are not captured by TIF revenue. So for purposes of TIF, they would get the benefit of, they would realize the benefit of the referendum market value growth and the increase in market value growth to the school district. So while the school district doesn't get to capture all the new taxes off the project, one of the important ways that they do capture revenue from a project is still available to them, and they still benefit from that. So there's less of an impact on school districts than maybe the conventional wisdom might be. So as it relates to what are the statutory findings necessary to approve a TIF district? So there's one main finding that we have to make, and it's that the proposed development, in the opinion of the city, would not reasonably be expected to occur solely through private investment within the reasonably foreseeable future. This is also known, or what's known as the but-for test. So it's the finding that the proposed development would not occur but for the use of tax increment financing. And the idea behind this test is kind of essential to the philosophy of tax increment as a whole. We want to be good stewards of the public's dollars and the public's tax dollars. We want to make sure that we're only investing in projects that would not otherwise have occurred. We want to be able to verifiably make that determination. So a lot of times when we do the but-for test, we can evaluate a project perform on the estimated rate of return to the developer to see what the return would be for the project with and without assistance, and use that as a means of measuring if the project would be likely to occur but for the requested assistance. And by making that but for finding, and by knowing that this is a project that in fact would not have occurred but for the requested assistance, we know that that future tax revenue that is being captured is not revenue that is necessarily being lost. That revenue wouldn't be in existence if the project was incapable of happening but for the use of the tax increment. So that's kind of the philosophy behind why the legislature in Minnesota and most other states allow for the use of tax increment financing. Is it goes back to this but-for test. Is we're not capturing revenue that would have been realized by these taxing jurisdictions, because we're capturing revenue from projects that would not have otherwise occurred but for the use and capture of that revenue. So that's kind of the philosophy, and hopefully that makes some sense as to why TIF districts are allowed to be in place, and then also how we go about making sure that we're being good stewards of the public's use or public's tax dollars, and that we're not incentivizing projects that would otherwise happen, that the TIF isn't just going to make an extra dollar for a developer, but it's going for a necessary purpose to make a project feasible. And then the other thing that we do with the but-for test as related to that is we want to make sure that not only is the assistance necessary, but that the amount of assistance that's being provided is a reasonable amount. We don't want to overpay for a project and with the amount of TIF assistance if a lesser amount would still make that project feasible. So that's another thing that gets evaluated as part of that but-for test, and by looking at the rate of return to the developer and using that as an objective measure for how we would make the but-for test. So the idea with the but-for test is to provide minimum subsidy required to complete the project and to mitigate the city risk. So for a redevelopment district, what are the qualifications? So there's specific statute dictates the qualifications for a redevelopment district. And again, these are based on the condition of the property and the current condition of the property. So over 70% of the parcels in the district have to be occupied by improvements. What the legislature is saying here is they want us to create redevelopment districts for properties that have things on them. They don't want us to try to be able to pull in a bunch of greenfield space into a TIF district and call it a redevelopment district. They want to make sure that the parcels are truly substandard and blighted by the presence of buildings and improvements on them. So over 70% of the parcels have to have some level of development on them, be it parking lots, buildings, structures, improvements, utilities. They can't just be greenfield. And then in addition to that, the buildings in the TIF district has to be referred to as or known as what's structurally substandard to a degree requiring substantial renovation or clearance. So structurally substandard is defined as requiring improvements to meet the current building codes, which would cost more than 15% of the cost of constructing a new structure. So TIF districts, and commonly when you're creating a redevelopment district, the city will hire an outside independent analysis to do a building study to evaluate the qualifications of the district, and particularly the building for qualification within a TIF district. So we want to make sure that the cost of improving that building to meet the current building code is greater than 15% of the cost of constructing that building new. That's the threshold for defining what's known as a structurally substandard building. And more than 50% of the buildings within the redevelopment district area have to meet that criteria. And it's important that it's more than 50, because we've ran into circumstances where we'll have two buildings within a district. One of them meets it, one of them doesn't. Unfortunately, that doesn't qualify for a redevelopment district. So again, redevelopment district qualifications based on the condition of the property, the current condition of the building, and the substantial cost to make that building compliant with current building code. Additionally, redevelopment districts allow for up to 25% of the TIF funds to be spent on public improvements outside of the TIF district area. So the TIF district area is the defined boundaries of the parcels that the development's going to occur on, and most of the expenditures have to occur with that area. But you can pool and spend a portion of the cost outside of that area, including the 10% that the city retains for administration. And then additionally, the other requirement with a redevelopment district is that 90% of the TIF revenue has to be used to reimburse the cost of correcting conditions that allow the TIF district to be qualified. The idea here is that the legislature wants the captured tax increment revenue to be used to reimburse costs that allowed the property to be considered blighted. They wanted there to be a direct nexus between the use of TIF and the qualifications of the district. So these are the things that the use of TIF can be limited to, and there has to be a nexus between the use of TIF and the removal of that blighting feature. And again, the city administrative expenses are eligible under that 90% test. And then again, the redevelopment TIF district has a term of 25 years from the receipt of first increment. And with that, I'll turn it over for questions. Hopefully that made some sense. This might be the earliest I've ever given this presentation.
Thank you, Tom. Really appreciate you doing this for us and taking time this morning. So it is open to questions. Anybody?
I can make a comment. I know I got some questions on chat about if the city already has a TIF district. Tom, do you want to kind of explain how the creation of a TIF district is generally initiated? With it's kind of per project or a developer that's working with the city to try to make a project happen. It's kind of a case-by-case basis.
Yeah, it's a little bit on a case-by-case basis, but the typical process is that the city will have an application that'll kind of lay out the process and the information that would be requested as part of a submittal from a developer seeking TIF district. So it's kind of it's mostly a reactive process. The developer comes in, submits an application, and then the city will start the process. We've helped the city, or we provided the city with the draft application, and usually associated with that application is a requirement that the developer would make an escrow deposit that would be used to fund the cost of creating the district, so that the city's not coming out of pocket for those dollars, and help to create the funding for the necessary steps, the creation of the TIF plan, the drafting of resolutions by legal counsel, and then as well as the blight finding studies and the like. And the other thing I forgot to mention with the blight study is the city can adopt, excuse me, and the city can make that blight finding in advance of the creation of a TIF district. So if there's a site that is eligible right now, the city can adopt a resolution making that finding that property qualifies as a redevelopment district. And then if they want to remove that blighted building, the city can actually go ahead and demolish that building if they want to. And then they have a 4-year window within which they can create a tax increment revenue or tax increment district in the future. So the legislature wants to give the city's ability to remove blight while still preserve that underlying qualification of a TIF district by allowing this process where the city could adopt a resolution making that finding and then preserving the ability to create a TIF district over the next 4 years. You don't have to necessarily demolish the building in that case either. It's just important if you do demolish the building that you've done that finding first, because otherwise once the building's demolished, you can no longer make that finding. So that's the reason for the need for the resolution, but it's nice to have that flexibility.
That's a really good point. So a good example in Fergus Falls, so the city council probably within the last, 2 months, Ben or Anthony, you can jump in, made a resolution for the dairy property, for example, to consider potentially using redevelopment TIF in the future, because like Tom said, if they wouldn't have done that, once the site was totally demolished, it would no longer qualify for redevelopment TIF. So that was a really good proactive move to set in place so that once we get to the point to develop that site, if that TIF assistance is necessary, we can still move forward with it. Whereas if they didn't approve that resolution, we would not be able to utilize that tool.
Yeah, and the nice thing with that is it doesn't obligate the city to do anything in regards to the creation of a TIF district. It just maintains that flexibility going forward in the event that it could be a significant or transformative development and it might need that additional tool. So it's nice to maintain the ability to potentially use that tool if necessary. Doesn't obligate you to, but it still gives you the ability to in the future that would have been lost with the demolition had that resolution not been adopted. And that building was far enough gone that we just were able to adopt a resolution without really having to go through the full study.
Right.
Okay, anything else of Tom?
Tom, did you want to just address the interest, how that gets handled?
Yeah, so when we talk about tax increment dollars and when we talk about the pay-as-you-go note amount, we size the pay-as-you-go note on the basis of a principal amount of cost, and that's usually the current or net present value of the tax increment revenue stream. So when we talk about reimbursing developer, so if say, let's just say a hypothetical $1 million was the TIF reimbursement amount, that'd probably be awfully high, but let's say it was $1 million. So in most cases, that principal amount, so the TIF will be referred to as reimbursing the developer for $1 million in site eligible improvements over time at an interest carrying cost. Because the developer is going to be reimbursed that money over time, they're going to have to fund it up front. They're going to either have to borrow for that $1 million of improvements, or they're going to have to take existing money out of current funds to fund that $1 million worth of improvements. But they're spending that money in today's dollars and incurring the cost today, but they're only going to get reimbursed over time. So we assume that there's going to be an interest cost, the loss of that money or the borrowing of that money for purposes of funding those improvements. So when we reimburse the developer, the tax increment revenue goes towards reimbursing them both the principal amount as well as the interest carrying expense that the developer would have incurred. So the contract will have typically 3 terms as part of the TIF note. It'll have the ratio or the amount of tax increment that's being paid to the developer. Usually it's 90%, so the city would take 10, the other 90% would go to the developer. It'll have the principal amount of the tax increment, and then it'll have what the interest cost would be, or the interest rate on the reimbursement of that. So 4, 5, 6%, depending on what current rates are. And we always try to set that at the developer's private borrowing rate. So when we go through the pro forma and the but-for test, we'll ask them to tell us what their anticipated financing will be on their private borrowing for the project as a whole. So if they're borrowing at, say, a 5% interest amount to fund their entire project, we will set the interest rate on the pay-as-you-go note at that same interest rate, because that allows us to make sure that we're not over reimbursing the developer. We don't want to say the pay-go interest rate is 6%, but they borrowed at 4%, and now they're somehow trying to collect an extra 2% in cost reimbursement that they didn't actually incur. So we always set it at the actual rate that they'll be borrowing at and incurring with their financing, because again, we're reimbursing them over time with future tax increment dollars, and they're losing the use of that money today or are funding it. So
Okay.
does that make sense?
Yep, thank you.
All right, anything else?
Was the audio okay? Annie was letting me know that maybe it was a little choppy, or?
It was a little choppy on my end. I don't know if others, it wasn't at the beginning, but it got a little choppy, but I caught it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Same here. So Tom, thank you very much for doing this. That's really helpful, and we really appreciate it, and look forward to doing some projects.